October 26th, 1970. Deep beneath the ice-choked waters of the Barents Sea, a U.S. Navy submarine, the USS Halibut, 587, ghosted through the frigid abyss. Inside its cramped, tritium-lit control room, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee. This wasn't a patrol. This was a reconnaissance mission born of Cold War paranoia and technological desperation. For years, the U.S. had been chasing shadows, trying to penetrate the Soviet Union's most closely guarded military secrets. Above the surface, the Soviets used vast networks of shortwave radio, easily intercepted by American intelligence. But their most critical communications, the high command directives, the nuclear launch codes, the movements of their massive fleet, traveled by a different, much more secure medium, submarine communication cables. In the bowels of the Halibut, hunched over a bank of custom-built sonar and magnetic anomaly detectors, was a civilian engineer, Bill O. Bond. Bond, with his wire-rimmed glasses and perpetually rumpled shirt, looked less like a spy and more like a university professor. He was, in a way, the father of the ship's current mission. For years, the accepted wisdom at the Naval Intelligence Command, NIC, was that tapping a Soviet deep-sea cable was impossible. The cables were laid on the seabed, hundreds of feet down, encased in layers of steel and tar, shielded against electromagnetic interception, and traversing some of the most remote and hostile environments on Earth. Tapping them would require a submersible vessel, capable of delicately securing a listening device, and then retrieving it, all while remaining invisible to the ever-present threat of Soviet trawlers and patrol ships. It was too complex, too risky, too far-fetched. Bond, however, had an obstinate, almost reckless belief. They were looking for the wrong thing. Traditional intelligence sought a visible signal, a flicker of radio wave, but Bond theorized that the cables themselves, though heavily shielded, had a tiny, exploitable electromagnetic signature. He persuaded his superiors at the NIC to dedicate a fraction of their budget to outfitting the Halibut, a vessel known more for its deep-sea salvage and clandestine recovery work than for traditional espionage. They stripped out a torpedo tube to make room for a massive side-scanning sonar array and a cavernous chamber for a deep submergence rescue vehicle, DSRV, an unclassified cover for the experimental, custom-built submersibles that would actually perform the cable tap. The Halibut was now an intelligence collection vessel, a titanium shell, full of ambition and classified modifications. Its mission today, however, was simple: find the cable. They had rough coordinates extrapolated from outdated Soviet fishing charts and a few intercepted radio transmissions. But the ocean floor was a maze of geological features and noise. Commander James F. Bradley, a man with the calm demeanor of a seasoned veteran, watched the depth gauges. "Maintain present course, Mr. Bond," he instructed the sonar operator. "We've got 5 more miles in this grid before we turn back." The tension in the room was palpable. The success of Operation Ivy Bells, the code name for the entire effort, hinged on this moment. A single mile off course, and Bond's impossible idea would be relegated to a footnote in Cold War failures. Suddenly, a faint, rhythmic anomaly appeared on Bond's new magnetic detection equipment. It wasn't the signature of a passing ship, nor was it a geological spike. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible hum, a consistent thrum of electrical current moving through metal. Bond's heart hammered against his ribs. He leaned into the microphone. "Commander," his voice was strained, "I believe we have contact. Bearing 090. Depth, approximately 380 feet. It's too clean to be noise. That's our target." The whole control room seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't a signal from the cable. It was the magnetic ghost of the cable, whispering its location to an enemy 380 feet above it. The Halibut had found the Severomorsk Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky primary Soviet naval communication line, the main nervous system connecting the massive Pacific and Northern fleets. The impossible had just become terrifyingly real. The discovery of the cable, an achievement in itself, was only the first, simplest hurdle. The real challenge lay in tapping it. The Soviet cable, designed for maximum resilience, was not a simple copper line. It was a coaxial beast, armored with steel tape and insulated with thick polyethylene, running high-frequency communications that carried thousands of simultaneous voice and teletype channels. Operation Ivy Bells had secured the target, but it lacked the weapon. Back in the secure, nondescript labs of the Naval Intelligence Command, NIC, in Washington, D.C., the team led by the head of the Special Projects Section, Captain Roger C. Grooms, began the frantic development of a listening device, a tap that defied conventional physics. This device couldn't pierce the cable, which would inevitably trip an alarm or degrade the signal beyond recognition. It had to be inductive. It needed to sense and record the minute magnetic fluctuations caused by the flow of Soviet data without making physical or electrical contact with the internal conductors. The conceptual design, initially mocked as a tin cannon wire project, was spearheaded by Dr. Eleanor Vance, a brilliant but notoriously demanding electrical engineer brought in from MIT's Lincoln Laboratory. Vance's approach was radical. She proposed building an enormous, custom-machined inductive coil, so sensitive it could pick up the whispers of the data stream from outside the cable's thick steel armor. This tap wasn't small. It was conceived as a self-contained, pressurized cylinder, over 20 feet long and 6 feet in diameter. Massive enough to house an array of advanced recording equipment, a power source, and a custom-engineered magnetic sensor array. The device was given the code name Kingfisher. The Kingfisher was an engineering nightmare. It had to be built to withstand the crushing pressures of the deep sea, nearly 400 pounds per square inch, and operate autonomously in the near-freezing water for weeks, even months at a time. Its power source was the most significant breakthrough, a highly classified, long-life plutonium-238 radioisotope thermoelectric generator, RTG, essentially a tiny, self-contained nuclear battery capable of powering the sensitive electronics for years. This RTG, shrouded in lead shielding and secured in a titanium housing, gave the Kingfisher the endurance no battery pack could match. The internal recording system was equally complex. It utilized state-of-the-art, high-density analog reel-to-reel magnetic tapes, a crucial choice. Digital recording, though emerging, was too bulky and power-intensive for this application. The analog tapes, specifically manufactured to maximize storage capacity, could store the entirety of the Soviet communication stream for up to 45 days before needing to be retrieved. This meant the halibut would only need to risk a deployment mission every month and a half, dramatically reducing the odds of detection. Construction took place in a sealed, subterranean hangar at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Maine, under the cover story of developing a new deep-ocean acoustic monitoring buoy. Every technician, every welder, every engineer was required to possess a top-secret, special compartmented information, SCI, clearance, a level of secrecy so high that the majority of the U.S. Navy's command structure remained completely unaware of the project's existence. By late 1971, the first full-scale prototype was ready for deep-water testing. The assembled Kingfisher looked less like a spy device and more like a captured alien spacecraft. A huge, silver cylinder bristling with acoustic baffles and specialized pressure ports. It was too large to fit through the halibut's standard moon pool hatch. This required the halibut itself to undergo a second, even more secretive modification. A special, enlarged aft-hull hangar bay was designed and fitted, complete with a watertight door capable of launching and recovering the enormous bug. This modification forever changed the silhouette of the once-standard nuclear submarine, turning her into a unique, single-purpose intelligence platform. The Kingfisher was ready, but the process of deployment, of secretly landing this 20-foot, plutonium-powered monster onto a live Soviet military cable, remained a terrifying and unprecedented gamble. Spring 1972. A thick, oppressive fog clung to the waters off Kamchatka Peninsula. The USS Halibut Sisson 587, now a truly Frankensteinian marvel of espionage technology, was back in the Soviet backyard, its new, cavernous aft hangar housing the massive Kingfisher listening device. Commander Bradley stood on the halibut's bridge, the tension etched deeply around his eyes. Their location was precise, thanks to Bond's magnetic ghost hunting a year prior, but the execution of the tap was the most terrifying phase. The deployment of the Kingfisher relied on a custom-built, tethered deep submergence vehicle, DSV, nicknamed the Manta, a small, highly maneuverable submersible designed specifically to work in the deep. Lieutenant Commander Michael R. Thorne, a veteran submariner cross-trained as a deep-sea diver and pilot, was at the Manta's controls. He and his co-pilot, Chief Petty Officer Alan Rourke, were sealed inside the cramped sphere, running through pre-launch checklists with meticulous, almost surgical calm. The halibut slowed its descent, leveling off 50 feet above the seabed. The hangar door hissed open, flooding the launch bay with frigid water. The Kingfisher, ballasted precisely to achieve neutral buoyancy, was carefully guided out of the hangar by a hydraulic arm and then released, an enormous silver whale sinking slowly toward the black abyss. Thorne guided the Manta out next, a tiny shadow maneuvering around the gargantuan Kingfisher. The visual clarity in the deep was minimal. They relied almost entirely on high-frequency sonar imaging and specialized low-light cameras mounted on the Manta's remotely operated manipulators. Their target, the Soviet Severomorsk-Petropavlovsk cable, was located on a gentle slope, partially buried in silt. A fortunate find, as a rocky bottom would have made the entire operation impossible. Okay, Manta, you are clear for final approach. Sonar shows the target 3 meters to port. Bradley's voice crackled through the Manta's communication system, filtered by the thick water. Thorne eased the Manta forward, its powerful thrusters stirring the fine benthic sediment. On the main screen, the first clear image of the Soviet cable appeared. A black tar-stained cylinder, thick as a man's torso, running silently across the gray seabed. This was the Soviet Union's spinal cord, carrying the lifeblood of their military communications. The process of installation was a slow, agonizing ballet of engineering. The Kingfisher was not simply dropped onto the cable. It had to be cradled around it. The device was designed in 2 massive, hinged halves, connected by a powerful pneumatic clamp. Thorne and Rourke had to use the Manta's manipulators to guide the Kingfisher's first half directly beneath the cable, leveraging the cable itself to help align the device. This took nearly 4 hours of painstaking effort, every movement requiring minute corrections to counteract the deep sea currents and the crushing pressure. Finally, the first half was in position. Now came the most dangerous part, the closure. The second half of the Kingfisher, containing the delicate inductive coil array developed by Dr. Vance's team, was guided down. The hydraulic arms of the Manta nudged, pushed, and held the enormous shell in place. Thorne gave the command. A series of deep, metallic clangs echoed through the water as the pneumatic clamp engaged, sealing the 2 halves around the cable. The Kingfisher was now in place, an invisible leech fixed to the Soviet artery. On the halibut, a cheer went up, quickly muffled by Commander Bradley. But the mission wasn't complete. They needed confirmation. Inside the Kingfisher, the RTG hummed to life, powering the electronics. A few tense minutes passed before a faint, but clear, digital signal appeared on the halibut's acoustic receiver. It was a burst transmission, confirming the device was powered on, sealed, and, most importantly, receiving a clean, high-fidelity data stream from the Soviet cable. It was working. The impossible tap was live. The data collection had begun, silently recording the secrets of the Soviet Pacific Fleet. Now, they had to wait 45 days before they could risk returning to retrieve the first set of tapes. The successful deployment of the Kingfisher in 1972 ushered in the golden age of Operation Ivy Bells. After the agonizing 45-day wait, the USS Halibut returned to the Kamchatka slope to retrieve the first set of tapes. The retrieval was in many ways more difficult than the deployment. The submarine had to approach the seabed, guide the Manta back down, and then carefully unlock and remove the internal tape canister, a task that required Thorne and Rourke to work entirely by feel and sonar, relying on the Manta's specialized tools. The process was fraught with risk. Disturbing the massive tap could send it tumbling down the slope, or worse, sever the Soviet cable and expose the entire operation. When the tape canister was finally recovered, sealed, and brought back to the surface and transferred to the Halibut Secure Lab, the sense of anticipation was immense. The tapes, once flown by an NSA courier under a strict chain of custody back to the specialized decryption facility at Fort Meade, Maryland, revealed an intelligence treasure trove far exceeding the wildest expectations of the National Security Agency, NSA, and the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA. The Soviets, confident in the physical security of their deep-sea armored cable, had made a monumental mistake. They had foregone the expensive and complex process of full-spectrum encryption. The communications flowing through the Severomorsk-Petropavlovsk line were being transmitted in clear text, unencrypted. The data stream contained nearly every vital command and communication between the Soviet Navy's high command in Moscow and its massive Pacific fleet. The intelligence analysts at Fort Meade were suddenly drowning in real, unvarnished Soviet secrets. They learned nuclear submarine patrol schedules and capabilities, exact deployment patterns, maintenance logs, and performance specification for the advanced Delta-class nuclear missile submarines, including their maximum depth and acoustic signatures. This information was invaluable for the U.S. Navy's anti-submarine warfare, ASW, efforts. Military technology and weapon systems, detailed design characteristics for new missile systems, radar arrays, and torpedoes. U.S. engineers immediately began developing countermeasures based on this highly specific, first-hand data. Command and control, C2, vulnerabilities. Perhaps most crucially, the transcripts revealed the personalities, operational protocols, and decision-making weaknesses within the Soviet command structure. The U.S. learned exactly how long it took for a critical message to move from a naval base to a deployed unit. The success was so profound that Operation Ivy Bells was immediately expanded. The original Kingfisher tap was replaced with a newer, even larger version dubbed the Cherokee, capable of storing tapes for up to 90 days. The Halibut was eventually retired from the mission, replaced by the more advanced and quieter USS Parcha. This is in 683, and USS Richard B. Russell. This is in 687. These submarines were given even more extensive modifications, including retractable thrusters for precise seabed maneuvering and a strengthened moon pool to handle the retrieval of the now heavier taps. The intelligence gathered was so sensitive and so critical to U.S. national security that its existence became perhaps the most closely held secret of the Cold War. Only a select group of officers and technicians, fewer than 200 people, were ever fully read into Ivy Bells. The process was known as the Gold, a term reflecting the unparalleled value of the clear text intelligence. This steady, reliable stream of Soviet secrets allowed the U.S. military to anticipate, model, and plan against Soviet actions with a level of precision that had been previously unimaginable. For nearly 10 years, from 1972 through 1980, the operation continued flawlessly. The U.S. submarines would periodically return, often in the dead of winter when Soviet surface patrols were minimal, perform the exchange, and silently slip away. The Soviets remained utterly oblivious that, beneath the waves of their most secure naval territory, the West had physically affixed a listening device to the backbone of their military empire. The very confidence they placed in the cable security was the key to their decade-long exposure. The entire dynamic of the Cold War naval balance had been secretly and irrevocably tilted in America's favor. As Operation Ivy Bells matured, the technical success brought with it an escalating burden of operational security, OPSEC. The intelligence pipeline was now a torrent, but the sheer volume and sensitivity of the information threatened to expose the source. If the Soviets ever noticed that U.S. naval movements or diplomatic stances were too perfectly tailored to their own internal communications, they would inevitably suspect a deep penetration of their security and start hunting for the bug. To mitigate this catastrophic risk, the intelligence community implemented a draconian multi-layered sanitization process. The data harvested from the Kingfisher and later the Cherokee taps could not be used directly in any military or policy action. Instead, the raw intelligence, the gold, was first analyzed and then laundered. For example, if the tapes revealed a specific route for a Soviet submarine patrol, the U.S. Navy could not simply deploy a hunter-killer sub to that exact spot. They would have to fabricate a plausible secondary source, perhaps an overflight by an innocuous patrol plane or a supposed tip from a traditional naval asset, to justify the counteraction. This process was complex and required the creation of thousands of fictional intelligence threads, all designed to mask the single, perfect source. The circle of those with access to the gold remained impossibly small, centered around the NSA's Special Projects team and a select group of high-level intelligence directors. One of the most critical individuals within this hyper-secret environment was Ronald William Pelton. Pelton was not a deep-sea diver or a submarine commander. He was a highly trained but mid-level Russian-language signals analyst working at the NSA's Special Analysis Division in the mid-1970s. His job was to wade through the massive transcriptions and decipher the nuances of Soviet military dialect and technical jargon. Pelton, by the nature of his work, was privy to the sanitized reports and had direct, though compartmentalized, knowledge of the caliber and source of the intelligence, enough to recognize its staggering importance. However, beneath the cloak of Cold War professionalism, Pelton was a man crumbling under personal and financial distress. By the late 1970s, he was deeply in debt, facing bankruptcy, and resentful of what he perceived as the NSA's rigid hierarchy and poor compensation. He felt overlooked and underappreciated despite handling some of the nation's most sensitive secrets. In 1979, fueled by desperation, resentment, and a misguided sense of entitlement, Pelton quit the NSA. For nearly a year, Pelton drifted, trying to find footing outside the intelligence world, but his financial situation only worsened. The memory of the gold, the ultimate secret he possessed, began to burn in his mind. He knew, intimately, the precise nature of the operation, the capabilities of the taps, and the location of the Severomorsk Petropavlovsk cable. His knowledge was a time bomb. In late 1980, Pelton made his move. He walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and, after fumbling through the initial security, demanded to speak to a senior KGB officer. He was prepared to sell the most devastating secret in U.S. history. His decision would unleash a chain of events that would instantly and violently unravel the decade of flawless intelligence gathering that had defined Operation Ivy Bells. The silence and security of the ocean depths were about to be shattered not by sonar, but by the reckless greed of a disgruntled insider. The secret, guarded by titanium hulls and layers of military bureaucracy, was now in the hands of the very enemy it was designed to monitor. Ronald Pelton's approach to the Soviet embassy in 1980 was initially met with suspicion by the KGB residency. Spies offering themselves up are rarely trusted without extensive vetting, and Pelton, dressed in ill-fitting civilian clothes and reeking of desperation, did not fit the profile of a top U.S. intelligence asset. He was shuffled to a junior officer, Valentin Gerasimov, who was initially dismissive. Pelton, realizing he needed to prove the immediate value of his knowledge, didn't mention Operation Ivy Bells by name, but instead provided tantalizing fragments of information that only a handful of people in the U.S. government would know. He spoke of a deep-sea cable operation in the Sea of Okhotsk, describing the type of intelligence being gathered and the fact that the Soviets had, for years, been transmitting their highest-level naval communications unencrypted. He referenced the specific technical sophistication of the listening devices, mentioning their self-contained power source, the plutonium RTG, and the massive modifications to the U.S. submarines involved. This was not conjecture. It was highly specific, verifiable operational detail. Gerasimov, sensing the weight of the information, immediately elevated the case through the KGB chain of command. Within hours, the information was on a secure line to the First Chief Directorate, PGU, headquarters in the Yasenevo Forest, Moscow. The leadership there, recognizing the potentially catastrophic exposure of their military infrastructure, ordered immediate, aggressive action. Pelton was ushered into a safe house, debriefed, and given a preliminary payment, a fraction of what he demanded, but enough to stabilize his crushing debt. He was instructed to return with more specific details. Pelton, galvanized by the immediate cash and the attention, returned to the embassy repeatedly over the following months. He systematically betrayed every operational detail he knew. The code name Ivy Bells, the identity of the primary vessel, USS Halibut and its successors, the precise coordinates of the cable tap in the Sea of Okhotsk, and the fact that the operation had been running continuously for almost a decade. He explained the method of exchange, the periodic return of the submarine to retrieve the tape canister. The information hit Moscow like a strategic nuclear strike. The realization that the U.S. had been reading their most sensitive military communications in real time for years created a storm of internal recrimination and paranoia within the Soviet Navy and the KGB. The fact that the highly armored deep-sea cable, the ultimate symbol of secure communication, had been compromised by a massive, unseen bug was an unbearable humiliation. Immediate damage control was ordered. The Soviet Navy was dispatched to the approximate location described by Pelton. However, the exact coordinates were difficult for Pelton to recall, and the deep, silent tap was still invisible. What the Soviets did possess was the exact operational profile of the U.S. deployment. They knew the Americans would be returning soon for a routine tape exchange. The KGB began a covert counteroperation to locate the device without overtly signaling to the U.S. that their secret was compromised. They deployed specialized deep-sea trawlers, outfitted with custom magnetic detection equipment, to sweep the seabed in the target area. The goal was to locate the enormous cylindrical tap, which would provide a massive magnetic anomaly on the otherwise clean seabed. The hunt was on, silent and deadly, and the U.S. Navy, unaware that their source was compromised, was already preparing the next routine voyage of the USS Parcha, 683, to the Sea of Okhotsk. Pelton had created a massive trap, and the unsuspecting U.S. submarine was heading directly into it. The 10-year perfect run of Operation Ivy Bells was about to end in disaster, not with a technical failure, but with a human betrayal. Late 1980, while the USS Parcha, Sisson 683, the successor to the Halibut, was preparing for its routine, classified journey to the Sea of Okhotsk, the Soviet Navy was already executing the information gifted to them by Ronald Pelton. The immediate priority was finding the physical device before the Americans could retrieve or destroy it. The Soviet effort was spearheaded by Vice Admiral Nikolai V. Kirilov, head of the Soviet Pacific Fleet's Counterintelligence Division, a man known for his ruthless efficiency. Kirilov utilized the intelligence Pelton provided on the tap's physical characteristics, its size, its magnetic components, and its location along the deep-sea communication line. Specialized Soviet oceanographic vessels, disguised as fishing trawlers but loaded with sensitive magnetometers and deep-tow sleds, were dispatched to the Kamchatka slope. The search was methodical and tense. The ocean floor is a noisy, complex place, full of mineral deposits and magnetic distortions from volcanic rock. However, the Kingfisher/Cherokee tap, with its massive steel housing, internal electronics, and most importantly, the lead-shielded plutonium RTG power source, presented a magnetic signature unlike anything natural. It was an enormous, man-made anomaly. After weeks of sweeping the target area, one of the modified trawlers, the Valentin Katorga, registered a massive, unambiguous spike on its magnetic detection gear. The location was precisely where the Soviet cable ran down the slope. Admiral Kirilov immediately ordered the trawler to secure the location and dispatched a top-secret deep submergence rescue vehicle, DSRV, ironically similar to the U.S. Manta but repurposed for recovery, to the site. The DSRV's cameras sent back chilling images to the trawler's control room. There, clamped securely onto the thick Soviet cable, was the massive, cylindrical device. It looked menacing and alien, a monument to a decade of American espionage. The technicians immediately recognized the sophisticated design. It was intact, sealed, and still actively recording Soviet communications, a final, silent testimony to its success. Admiral Kirillov personally oversaw the delicate, high-risk recovery operation. Using the DSRV's manipulators, Soviet engineers first had to verify the device's mechanism. They found a pneumatic clamp holding the two halves together. The fear was that the device might be booby-trapped or contain an explosive charge designed to sever the cable and destroy the evidence upon discovery. After careful examination, they determined the Americans had relied solely on secrecy, not on destruction. The device was simply a listener. A specialized heavy-duty lift was lowered to the seabed. The Soviet submersible detached the enormous tap from the cable, a painstaking process that took over 18 hours, and carefully secured it to the lift lines. The Kingfisher/Cherokee was hauled up from the crushing depths of the Sea of Okhotsk. The moment the massive 20-foot spy device broke the surface, the Soviets had irrefutable physical proof of the penetration. It was immediately shrouded in tarps and rushed onto a transport ship bound for a top-secret technical facility near Vladivostok. The discovery was a profound, multifaceted victory for the KGB and a strategic disaster for the U.S. Navy. The Soviets now possessed the actual technology. They could reverse engineer the sophisticated inductive coil, study the RTG power source, and understand the technical limits of U.S. deep-sea surveillance. Furthermore, the discovery allowed them to confirm the betrayal by Ronald Pelton, elevating his value and the severity of his crime. But the most critical piece of operational intelligence came from the tap itself. When Soviet engineers accessed the internal tape canister, they didn't find the intelligence the Americans had just collected. The tape had been recently retrieved. What they found, however, was a custom-made plaque affixed to the pressure hull by the Halibut's crew during one of the early maintenance visits. The plaque read, in mocking Russian, "From the American Naval Intelligence Command, we wish you a good day." The message, a final, audacious act of psychological warfare, only amplified the rage and humiliation of the Soviet command. They had been played for fools for 10 years, and they knew exactly who was to blame. The immediate aftermath of the Kingfisher/Cherokee recovery in late 1980 was characterized by a profound, terrifying silence on the Soviet side. The KGB and the Soviet Navy were disciplined enough to know that their reaction had to be covert and meticulously planned to trap or eliminate the U.S. submarine on its next return run. Meanwhile, in the United States, the intelligence community began to register the first subtle warning signs that something was desperately wrong. The USS Parchev, SN 683, the submarine designated to retrieve the next set of tapes, had been delayed by a minor mechanical issue, pushing its scheduled arrival at the Sea of Okhotsk well into 1981. This delay, though frustrating to the intelligence analysts awaiting their gold, ironically saved the submarine from steaming directly into the Soviet trap. The initial alarm was raised not by a direct confrontation, but by the cessation of a secondary, routine Soviet activity. For years, U.S. reconnaissance had noticed Soviet cable ships conducting periodic, visible maintenance along the Severomorsk-Petropavlovsk line, a normal and expected part of maintaining deep-sea infrastructure. Suddenly, these maintenance visits stopped. Not only that, but the electronic noise profile of the entire Soviet Far East communication network began to change. Analysts at the NSA noticed a rapid, system-wide shift in Soviet communication security protocols. High-level naval commands that had been transmitted in the clear for a decade were suddenly routed through new, sophisticated, and heavily encrypted channels. The clear text gold had abruptly turned to electronic static. The U.S. intelligence community had been cut off from its primary source. The most senior members of the Operation Ivy Bells task force, the few hundred people who knew the secret, convened in a sealed room at the Pentagon. Director of Central Intelligence, DCI, William J. Casey demanded an immediate explanation. The possibilities were agonizing. A technical failure of the tap itself? A Soviet discovery through accidental means? Or, the worst fear, a human penetration. Commander Richard A. Slocum, the officer now overseeing submarine intelligence collection, was ordered to dispatch the Parcha immediately, not for a tape exchange, but for a reconnaissance run. The new orders were explicit. Approach the known tap location with extreme caution. Do not attempt to recover the device unless absolutely certain of security. The primary goal was to confirm the tap's status. In the early spring of 1981, the USS Parcha crept back into the frigid waters of the Sea of Okhotsk, its crew operating under maximum tension. Lieutenant Commander Gregory M. Vance, piloting the Manta DSV, made the terrifying descent. The halibut crews had known they were seeking an invisible target. Vance's crew now knew they were seeking a target that might be heavily guarded, booby-trapped, or already gone. Vance's sonar and magnetic detectors were screaming with anomalies, but not the clean, familiar signature of the tap. The seabed around the cable was a mess of debris, strange trenches, and disturbed silt. When a Manta's floodlights cut through the darkness, the truth was immediately and visually devastating. The Cherokee was gone. In its place, clamped onto the Soviet cable, was a massive, concrete block surrounded by Soviet acoustic monitoring devices, a clear sign that the Soviets were now waiting. They had removed the American device and replaced it with a sensor array to detect any future intrusion. Vance radioed his devastating findings back to the Parcha. It's a clean extraction, Commander. They took it all, and they've left us a welcoming gift. The operation is compromised. The immediate reaction back in Washington was a controlled panic. The loss of the intelligence source was a devastating strategic blow, but the realization that the KGB was now in possession of the advanced U.S. technology, the inductive sensors, the high-density analog recorders, and critically, the plutonium RTG power supply, was a massive technological leak. The focus instantly shifted to identifying the source of the leak, initiating a furious, desperate internal investigation to find the traitor who had traded America's greatest secret for personal gain. The decade-long period of perfect intelligence was over, replaced by a dark, agonizing uncertainty. With the disastrous reconnaissance report from the USS Parcha, the U.S. intelligence community faced an unparalleled crisis. The source of the leak, now classified as a Category 1 penetration, had to be a person with top-level security clearance, intimate knowledge of the operation's technical details, and a profound proximity to the raw intelligence, the gold. The immediate, intense internal investigation was launched, codenamed Operation Checkmate, spearheaded by a joint task force of the FBI Counterintelligence Division and the NSA's Office of Security. The scope was narrowed to the few hundred people who had been read in to Operation Ivy Bells. Investigators meticulously examined the financial records, travel history, personal contacts, and psychological profiles of everyone involved. This process was slow, painstaking, and emotionally damaging to the dedicated personnel who had risked their lives and careers for the operation. The key to unlocking the puzzle lay in the technical details the Soviets now possessed. When the Soviet Navy analyzed the recovered Cherokee device, they gained knowledge of its most unique signature features, the custom-built inductive sensors, and the specific use of the long-life plutonium-238 RTG power supply. The FBI and NSA realized the traitor must have known both the operational location and the technical specifics of the tap's internal components. The focus eventually tightened on the civilian analysts who had access to the gold and the detailed technical debriefings. The FBI discovered a crucial pattern, a specific period in late 1980 and early 1981, where an unusual number of highly classified technical specifications had been discussed in closed-door sessions with a small group of analysts just before the Soviet reaction. One name kept recurring in the intersection of financial distress, proximity to the intelligence, and a demonstrated resentment toward the agency: Ronald William Pelton. Though he had resigned in 1979, his former colleagues remembered his volatile temperament and his deep, crushing financial difficulties, including a public bankruptcy filing. The FBI began discreet, 24-hour surveillance on Pelton. They found he was living modestly, but had made several unexplained cash deposits after his resignation. contradicting his declared financial woes. Furthermore, investigators used sophisticated NSA monitoring tools to reconstruct his movements during the period of the compromise. They found that Pelton had made several suspicious, unlogged visits to downtown Washington, D.C., near the Soviet embassy, disguised as job interviews. In late 1982, the case against Pelton solidified through an unexpected source: the defection of Vitaly Yurchenko, a high-ranking KGB officer, in 1985. While Yurchenko did not have direct knowledge of who the American spy was, he confirmed to CIA debriefers that the KGB had successfully recruited a disgruntled former NSA employee who provided a catastrophic compromise of a crucial U.S. intelligence collection program in the Sea of Okhotsk. Yurchenko's cryptic information immediately pointed directly back to the ongoing investigation into Pelton. Armed with this confirmation, the FBI moved in for the final interrogation. Pelton was summoned for a routine debriefing regarding his former duties. The FBI agents, led by veteran counterintelligence specialist Jack Fury, used a sophisticated, coercive interrogation technique, never directly accusing Pelton, but rather confronting him with the overwhelming circumstantial evidence of his financial movements and unauthorized contacts. Under relentless pressure, and believing he could still negotiate his way out of the crisis, Pelton began to crack. He eventually admitted to contacting the Soviets, initially minimizing his disclosures. But when Fury introduced details of the RTG power source and the specific cable location, Pelton realized the depth of the KGB's knowledge and his own exposure. In a moment of absolute despair, he confessed to selling the Operation Ivy Bell's secret to the KGB for a sum of approximately $35,000. The most devastating breach of U.S. secrets in a decade was sold for a pittance, the price of a small car. The traitor was identified, but the damage was irreversible. Ronald Pelton's confession in 1985 confirmed the decade-long compromise of Operation Ivy Bells and triggered a monumental geopolitical reckoning. The $35,000 paid to Pelton was arguably the most damaging investment the KGB ever made. The U.S. government now had to grapple not only with the embarrassing exposure of their most crucial intelligence operation, but also with the devastating implication of what the Soviets had learned by possessing the Cherokee Tap itself. The internal analysis conducted by the Department of Defense, DoD, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, JCS, was grim. The loss of the gold, the clear text communications, was immediate and crippling. The intelligence community lost its unparalleled window into Soviet strategic thinking, naval deployments, and technological advancements. The Cold War naval balance, which had been secretly tilted in America's favor, snapped back violently toward parity. More worrying was the strategic gift presented to the Soviets. By reverse engineering the Kingfisher/Cherokee device, the Soviets gained crucial insight into inductive tapping capabilities. They understood the precise sensitivity required for the inductive coil to pick up signals through their armored cable. This knowledge allowed them to develop immediate, effective countermeasures, including laying future cables deeper, using enhanced magnetic shielding, and, most critically, implementing advanced frequency-hopping encryption on all strategic military lines. Submarine technology. The Soviets now knew the operational depth and maneuvering capabilities of the USS Halibut and USS Parcha's custom-built DSVs, as well as the acoustic signatures generated by the deployment and retrieval process. They immediately increased their anti-submarine warfare, ASW, patrols in the Sea of Okhotsk, deploying specialized magnetic anomaly detectors, MAD, and bottom-moored acoustic hydrophone arrays, effectively turning their own territorial waters into a high-security electronic fortress. The RTG power source. The recovery of the plutonium-powered radioisotope thermoelectric generator was a major technological coup. While the Soviet Union had its own RTG technology, the American design allowed their engineers to study its materials' science and efficiency, potentially accelerating their own long-life, deep-sea electronic deployment projects. The U.S. Navy was forced to immediately suspend all operations related to Ivy Bells and shift its clandestine intelligence efforts. The custom-modified submarines, like the USS Parche, were given new, highly classified missions, focusing on collecting acoustic intelligence in international waters, away from the secure Soviet seabed. Politically, the compromise was contained. The U.S. government successfully managed to keep the details of the highly sensitive operation out of the public domain, even during Pelton's subsequent trial. The official charges against Pelton were carefully worded to refer only to the compromise of highly classified communications systems, without mentioning the deep-sea cable tap, the Sea of Okhotsk, or the names of the submarines. This was essential to prevent the Soviets from gaining further public confirmation of the scope of the operation. The long-term legacy of the compromise was a stark lesson in the danger of over-reliance on a single, non-redundant intelligence source. The NSA, realizing the fragility of physical collection methods, was compelled to massively accelerate its development of satellite-based signals intelligence, SIGINT, and advanced decryption programs. The loss of the gold in the deep sea drove billions of dollars of investment into space-based collection platforms and sophisticated computing power designed to break the very encryption the Soviets had implemented following the discovery. Operation Ivy Bells became the standard intelligence community case study for human penetration, a sobering reminder that no technology, however brilliant or securely deployed, is immune to the betrayal of a single, disgruntled individual. The ultimate irony was that the very success of the operation, the flawless retrieval of clear text secrets for a decade, created the critical vulnerability, the long-term presence of a massive, physical device that, once betrayed, provided the enemy with both the evidence and the technology of its defeat. Ronald Pelton's confession provided the FBI with the evidence it needed, yet the legal path to conviction was treacherous. The government was determined to prosecute him to the fullest extent of the law, but simultaneously terrified of revealing the true nature of Operation Ivy Bells in open court. The trial, therefore, became a complex, highly choreographed dance between justice and national security. Pelton was indicted on multiple counts of espionage and unauthorized retention of national defense information. The core challenge for the prosecution, led by the Department of Justice, DOJ, was how to prove Pelton's guilt without detailing the sensitive information he had compromised. Simply stating he gave away secrets was insufficient for a jury. They needed to demonstrate the specific knowledge only he possessed. The prosecution utilized the Classified Information Procedures Act, CIPA, a legal framework designed to manage classified evidence in criminal trials. This required the defense to agree to a substitution of evidence, replacing the true, catastrophic details of the deep sea tap with general, sanitized descriptions. The defense, knowing the government could not risk exposing the real secrets, initially argued that the sanitized evidence was too vague to allow for a proper defense, hoping to force the government's hand. To overcome this, the prosecution relied heavily on the testimony of Vitaly Yurchenko, the KGB defector who had indirectly pointed the finger at Pelton, and on the meticulous records of Pelton's own financial distress and suspicious movements near the Soviet embassy. They also introduced a crucial piece of evidence that was only moderately classified: the description of a specific experimental Soviet communication link that Pelton had discussed with the KGB, proving his access to the most compartmentalized intelligence. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when the FBI detailed Pelton's confession itself. The jury heard how Pelton, cornered and despairing, had admitted to selling the secret of the submarine operation and detailing this special listening device to the Soviets for a paltry sum. The government meticulously laid out the sequence of events: the resignation, the financial spiral, the visits to the Soviet embassy, and the rapid change in Soviet communication security that followed. They argued that Pelton, driven by resentment and desperation, had willfully and knowingly endangered national security for a few $1,000s. Pelton's defense attempted to portray him as a victim of poor agency management and a man coerced into a false confession. They argued that his memory was poor and the information he gave the KGB was old and largely useless. This argument was severely undermined by the physical evidence held by the Soviets, although the jury was never shown photographs of the recovered Cherokee tap. In June 1986, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Ronald Pelton was subsequently sentenced to 3 life terms in federal prison, a reflection of the extraordinary damage he inflicted on the U.S. intelligence apparatus. His was one of several high-profile espionage cases that rocked the American intelligence community in the 1980s, alongside those of Aldrich Ames and John Walker. These breaches collectively forced a massive overhaul of security and counterintelligence procedures across all U.S. agencies. The end of the Pelton saga brought closure, but not relief. The intelligence hole he had created remained, and the strategic advantages the Soviets gained by dissecting the Cherokee tap were still being exploited. The trial itself served as a powerful, albeit highly controlled, warning to others within the classified world. The consequences of betrayal, even of the most guarded secrets, would be absolute and permanent. The legacy of the engineer's impossible idea, born of ingenuity and daring, was now indelibly stained by the treachery of a financial debtor. The final chapter of Operation Ivy Bells is a study in contrasting legacies, a testament to engineering brilliance and a cautionary tale of human frailty. The operation, spanning nearly a decade, remains one of the most audacious and successful peacetime intelligence operations in history. The original engineer, Bill O. Bond, and the specialized crews of the USS Halibut, USS Parcha, and USS Richard B. Russell achieved would have been deemed technologically impossible. They demonstrated a profound mastery of deep-sea engineering, nuclear power integration, and clandestine submersible maneuvering. Their success provided the U.S. government with an unparalleled strategic advantage during a critical period of the Cold War, a decade of reading the enemy's mail that fundamentally shaped U.S. naval strategy, weapons development, and nuclear deterrence policy. The quiet, cold heroism of the submariners who risked their lives in Soviet territorial waters, navigating darkness and pressure to collect the tapes, is a forgotten epic of the Cold War. Following the compromise, the technological success of the Ivy Bells program was not abandoned, but immediately adapted. The capabilities honed by the engineers and submariners did not vanish. They were simply rerouted. The specialized submarines, particularly the USS Parcha, SSN 683, continue to be used for highly classified missions. Instead of tapping Soviet cables, they transitioned to seeking out and tapping international communications lines, often working in deeper, more difficult environments, leveraging the lessons learned on the Kamchatka Slope. The Parcha became the most decorated vessel in the U.S. Navy, a silent tribute to the technological foundation laid by Bond's original, impossible idea. The true, deep legacy of Ivy Bells is rooted in the strategic shift it forced upon both superpowers. For the U.S., the intelligence gathered served as a foundation for understanding Soviet military capabilities for the rest of the Cold War. Even after the tap was discovered, the decade of accumulated data provided analysts with a baseline for Soviet operational doctrine that remained invaluable for years, allowing them to better interpret the heavily encrypted traffic that followed. For the Soviet Union, the discovery of the Cherokee tap was a profound catalyst. It sparked massive investment in the security of their communications infrastructure and forced a reckoning within the KGB and the Navy over their operational complacency. They realized that physical security was no guarantee in the age of advanced electronics and deep-sea espionage. This forced shift toward aggressive encryption inadvertently benefited the U.S. years later, as Western technological superiority in computing and code-breaking eventually gave the NSA the upper hand in decrypting the Soviets' new, more complex messages. The Soviet reaction to Ivy Bells proved to be a delayed, technological boomerang. Today, Operation Ivy Bells remains a closely guarded piece of history. The details of the operations, the names of the engineers, and the exact coordinates of the tap are still restricted. The narrative is preserved in the annals of intelligence history as the ultimate expression of technological daring. It proves that in the invisible war beneath the waves, the greatest victories are often won not by bombs or brute force, but by ingenuity, persistent dedication, and the courage of the few who risked everything to listen in on the enemy's secrets. The story of the massive, silent tap on the Soviet cable, sitting in the deep for 10 years, ultimately confirms a core truth of espionage. The impossible is often simply the unattempted. The success of Ivy Bell's lay in believing in the unachievable. Its failure lay in trusting a single human being with a secret that was too big to keep.